chat as we go along, because we'll have plenty of time later for questions. So as we go through this, the real focus is just to get you thinking. It's not to be super prescriptive right now. It's more to get you thinking about what you currently do and are there ways that you could potentially do it a bit better. So I always start with this video when I talk about fitness testing and fitness training, because if you haven't seen this one, you know, it's a great video just to highlight the question of why. Why are you doing what you're doing? That's such an important question, because someone thought this was a good idea at some point. They thought there was some value here. It provided some benefit, which you could make argument anything can provide benefit if you can do it. But the risk-reward ratio here is not very good. I don't like the risk, and the reward isn't great. So when you're thinking about what types of tests are you doing, what types of training are you doing, make sure you keep this in mind as you go through. There's 4 big areas you want to make sure when you're talking about fitness that you're taking into account. Physiological adaptation, how does it impact the body physiologically? Psychologically, what are you trying to accomplish? A lot of people use fitness to make an athlete tougher or handle more or be able to deal with adversity better, things like that. From a standpoint of performance, how are you improving performance? What are you actually working on to make you a better tennis player? And then the 4th is injury prevention. So you've got to ask yourself every single day, how are you improving these 4 areas on every drill that you do, every test that you do, every program that you write? And if you can't answer those questions clearly and precisely, you probably aren't picking a good exercise. Just because there's an exercise out there doesn't mean you should do it. You have to have a purpose behind it. So the why. Why do we test? And it's pretty easy. We test every day, whether you know it or not. Some are formal tests, like a broad jump or long jump, like this athlete's doing. Some is just watching your athlete hit a tennis ball. You're testing in your mind, how they're hitting today. Is it better than yesterday? Is it worse than yesterday? What needs to be improved? Formalized testing allows us to benchmark or create baselines of where an athlete is today and where they need to get to based on their levels. So we created the Tennis Fitness Combine in sort of a response to all these questions. And there's all sorts of different tests you can do. What we did was try to use evidence-based data, meaning that there was at least 10 years of fitness testing data available, so normative data. So every test in here has actually over 3 decades nearly of data. So you know exactly where the athlete should be based on their level, male or female, junior at different stages of their junior development, as well as collegiate, pro, and adult. And it's easy to implement. It can be done in large groups. It can be done one-on-one. All you need is a tennis court, a tape measure, some tennis balls, and a medicine ball. And as long as you have that, you can do the testing. So there's way more information on that. If you just put Tennis Fitness Combine in, I think Davor will send out some links to some different things later as well. You can kind of look in that in more detail. But in general, what you're trying to accomplish is take an athlete in, say, a month's time. 89 inches was their test on day 1. A month later, they're at 95 inches. And that's with structured training. That's with appropriate improvement and getting them to have better lower body power. So this is not a tennis specific test, but it's a very important test that translates to lower body power, which then if you do the right things, you can improve the on-court aspect. So let me move forward quickly because I want to get through some other stuff. Warm-ups are really important in the whole fitness testing environment, because if we don't get the warm-ups done correctly, we don't optimize our time. And too many people use the warm-up not efficiently. If you're going to use it and you're going to do it right and do it precisely, and focus on stability, focus on range of motion, focus on neural activation, meaning getting the athlete to do some explosive type movements before they hit a tennis ball. So if you do all those types of things as part of your warm-up, you'll get a much better benefit from that perspective. So it's important to keep that in mind when we're talking fitness testing. So why do we do all this fitness testing? Because we're trying to improve movements like this. This is, we're talking about tennis. We're talking about improving a tennis athlete. This is the majority of movements that they need. Wide balls, deep balls, and then that first step after the serve typically, so loading in these patterns. These are probably the most important pattern for every tennis player to get good at. Unfortunately, most don't get great at this. They spend a lot of time doing training, but do they train these movements? And if you're not training these movements every day, pretty much, you're not optimizing the specificity of what we're trying to train for. So general training is important, especially at the younger ages, but you also need to do specific training. And all of these 4 things here are very specific to the movements on court that we want our athletes to get better at. The concept of training equals rehab and rehab equals training is not a new term. This has been around for over 50 years. This concept of every training session is also a rehab session, and every rehab session is also a training session. So although we many times break out injury prevention exercises or injury prevention movements, they're really still part of training. And the goal is to do as much prevention work as you can to avoid having the injuries. And that's really the goal of it all. So I'll give you a quick example. So this is an athlete, this is a college level athlete, was a top junior. And if you can see here, the left and right arm looks pretty different. Notice how the right arm doesn't fully extend. There's a bend in the elbow. And you can kind of see that this, if you've seen enough tennis players, you know that this is a right-handed tennis player. You don't need to be, very investigative to understand that this is a typical adaptation that we see in a right-handed tennis player. Some of it's necessary, but you don't want it to get extreme. If you have an extreme inability to straighten, that's potentially problematic. In this example here, this is a test actually from the fitness combine. And you can see here that the athlete with the photo on the right, if you see the left arm elbow is low, right elbow is high, that's measuring internal rotation at the left shoulder. So what we're talking about here is from a left shoulder standpoint. This photo on the left here, but the one with the blue line, that's actually showing internal rotation of the right shoulder. And we show, obviously, I think everyone can see that it doesn't look the same. This athlete side to side doesn't look the same. The right shoulder blade is depressed. We don't have as much range, and we see that shoulder blade kind of popping out a little bit. That's usually called a wing scapula is the result of this. And this ends up causing shoulder impingement, tightness, and also inability to fully utilize the upper arm in the best way possible. So if you, though, didn't test your athlete, you wouldn't know any of this stuff. If you just have them hit tennis balls, you wouldn't have picked up any of this thing. And this is a very simple test. And you could either see it a little bit from just looking at the athlete visually, but this gives you a very precise area to focus on. Again, simple test. You don't have to have huge qualifications and study for years to figure out how to do it. You can do it just by taking a photo of someone. So important to understand what we're good at and then how to utilize that. So here's an example serving. We've got an athlete who may have poor hip stability. Why? We see that the back knee on the male player here on the left shows that it's collapsing. That knee's collapsing. It's usually a hip issue or an ankle problem. If we see the female on the right, we see both knees pointing inwards. That's called valgus knee movement, which is usually a sign they have poor hip stability, some weakness somewhere, but we have to figure out where exactly that is. And how many coaches out there especially see players like this every day at your clubs? This is a pretty common occurrence to see, especially junior players with this problem. Usually it's pretty easy fix. We have to strengthen and stabilize the hip. We have to increase range of motion at the ankle. You do those 2 things, you're going to improve the athlete's ability to load the legs. So if you're having problems with serve speed, especially, take a look and see if this could be a cause. So what do? Basic exercises. Everyone hopefully has seen a couple of these before. I want to show you simple stuff. This is simple stuff that they can do. So one is just a monster walk. Another one here on the right is a hip bridge with hip abduction. So again, 2 very easy exercises that any athlete should be able to do. And this is going to work on hip stability. That's going to help avoid having the issue that we saw on the serve previously. Lower back, if we touch on that real quick, because that's a big problem for a lot of athletes. It's one of the #1 issues in growing athletes. If you're working with junior players, we see more past fractures, stress reactions in high-level competitive juniors than any other serious injury between the ages of 13 and 18. So it's really, really important to understand that that needs to be addressed. That's one of those scenarios that truly does need to be focused on. And there's two big ways that we have to get at it. One is doing mobility work like we're seeing on the right. That's thoracic range of motion. That's improving the athlete's ability to mobilize around. And then traditional core work. And there's a lot of varieties to it. People make arguments, well, you shouldn't do this type of core work or that type of core work. There's a lot of things that a tennis player needs. They need all these movements on the court. So you've got to incorporate some of this in training. The question is how much and when and how often. And that's that personalization aspect. You have to do different things from a personalization standpoint. So let's talk quickly about how we're going to focus a little bit on those, after the warm up, where do we go to? We go to speed power type exercises. And there's a whole series of things that you can do. A lot of it has to be explosive, has to be with a bit of rest. Too many people actually work their athletes a little bit too hard, meaning that you do too many exercises in a row without enough rest. If you're trying to work on speed and power, you need to make sure you give the athlete plenty of rest between exercises, because it's not an endurance session. It's really, really important to give them enough rest so they can perform the movements effectively. And improving movements is a lot more than just moving, meaning that you have to take care of the body. You have to get the hips very well prepared, meaning they have to have good mobility, good stability, which are two very different things. And a lot of tennis players struggle with that just based on the sport and how many hours you're on court. It tightens up every single day. So you have to spend a lot of time working on that. Now let's get into movement specifically. That's kind of the testing and getting an understanding of the athlete's body. Here, it's about how do we get them to move better. So this is a free resource. If you haven't gone to the ITPA website, go there, sign up for the emails, and you'll get this. It's nearly a 50-page booklet, and it's over 30 of the most common and important tennis movements. It's broken down step by step. And the reason this came about was about 5 years ago. I was doing a seminar with probably 50 of the best coaches in the world from about 12 different countries. And we were talking movements and footwork, and everyone was kind of saying the same thing about different movements and different shots, but they were all using different terminology. They were using, the double step and the hop step and the jump step and the pivot step and, the 2-2 and the 1-1. And half the time you weren't understanding what anyone was talking about, even though you were describing the exact same thing. So we got together a group of experts, coaches, strength coaches, and put together this resource, which basically just gave consistent names to the movements we see on court. So if you're looking to get like a little bit more into that, again, this was 100% free. It was just a resource that we thought the industry sort of needed because there was too much inconsistency in language. When someone says a semi-Western forehand, pretty much everyone knows what it means. When someone says a jab step or a pivot step, we should all know what that means. Or when we say a front crossover, most people know what that is. But how about a recovery step or a transitional double step? We've got to have consistency in language. So hopefully this helps a little bit with that, because that allows you then, when you're analyzing movement, whether it's in depth, like some of this stuff, or whether it's more simply when you're just on court and you're seeing something, you can then work on those specifics. And again, you don't want to make movement complicated, because unfortunately too many people overcomplicate movement. Movement needs to be simple, and it needs to be natural for the athlete. You don't want to force them into steps. You want to create the drills to put them in positions where those steps are what they have to use. So use the drill to improve movement. Don't force them into a certain step count. Too many times I've seen well-meaning people try to force athletes into certain step counts and step positions, and it's not the right way to train movement. It's important to make sure you put them in the positions and you may cue them with certain words or feelings, but you don't want to overforce or make it too technical, because movements has to be reactionary, it has to be natural, and it has to be based on what the athlete can do as well from a range of motion and flexibility standpoint. So here's an example of the terms, and then all of these come with photo sequences that you can look at to show how these steps work. So there's a series on lateral movements, backwards movements, forwards movement, recovery movements, return a serve, overhead, serve, and volleys. So again, a lot of these movements are similar. meaning that there's not much difference between certain movements. There's usually a shuffle or a crossover step, and there's usually a directional component to it. And that's how you need to really think about movements on the tennis court. So we don't want to overcomplicate it, but we also want to make sure that individuals are using the consistent terminology so everyone can communicate. Because in the world I live in, I deal with coaches, parents, agents, strength coaches, physical therapists, medical doctors, and I have to be able to describe what we're talking about in simple language that all those different people that may or may not know tennis that well can at least understand, and then we can cross communicate easily when we're trying to improve an athlete's performance. So again, go to the website, just download it. It's there free. So at this point, I think what I'll do is I'll stop sharing, and we can sort of open it up for questions. Hopefully that got people thinking a little bit, and it maybe stimulated some thoughts.
I like that, Mark. And yeah, we had one person said I can't find it on itpatennis.org. Just have
Yeah,
a
so
look.
if they have to sign up for the email, and because it'll automatically send it to them. And if you're already an ITPA member and you don't have it, it's in the member website. It's there for free for download.
Awesome. Yeah, all right, guys. So yeah, fire the questions. I have Nicholas Bennett. He's like, is there a good book Mark recommends for coaches to use? Obviously, Mark wrote a lot of books, so maybe one of yours. I mean, I read most of them, and yeah, I love the way you write it. It's easy. You play tennis, so I think that's so important. You've been a successful tennis player in college, and that is so important for me. When I read something, you put it into writing where a coach can understand that, or a player, right? There's so much things out there where I just, I mean, I studied sports science, so I understand the terms, but too many books are out there with these professional terms, and they just feel that, that's what I love. That's what I love about your books. It's easy to read and full of knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, the two best books I think that we've done that are in this space are Complete Conditioning for Tennis, and then Tennis Anatomy. Those two both go into the sort of the basics around training for tennis from a physical standpoint. The International Tennis Performance Association, though, has the most robust information on this topic. It has, hundreds of hours of education. So if you really want to get it deeper into it and go through protocols, progressions, how to apply it, all of that, I would take a look at the ITPA materials as well.
Yeah, Nicholas, we're good. Just ordered them today for this webinar. Good job, Nicholas. I love that. You're not going to regret it, as I said. Rajiv, at what age should a player start specializing in the sport, like going like really deep into the material?
Yeah, so this is a great topic. I've been involved in a lot of research on early specialization, late specialization, what's required, what do you need to do? And unfortunately, in this world we are in, everything gets broken down to a single statement. What age should we specialize? Should you specialize? Don't specialize. And it's not as simple as that, of course. We have to describe what we're talking about. You have to early initiate tennis to be really successful at tennis, meaning you want to expose someone as young as possible, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old. You want to have them hit tennis balls. You want to get them learning how to play the game at a young age when it's the easiest for them from a motor learning perspective. So that's called early initiation, initialize early. That doesn't mean they specialize early. What that means is that they play soccer, they play basketball, volleyball, they swim, they do all these other activities for a number of years. And there isn't a hard and fast age. It's not like when they hit 12, when they hit 10, when they hit 14. You don't want to do it based on that. You want to do it based on two big factors. One is, what are their goals? Potentially, if it's talking professionally, you have to specialize earlier because you need more time to develop certain skills, and your competition is also doing that. So that's the first thing. You got to figure out what are your long-term objectives here. If it is trying to be at the top of the game, you then have to determine, one, when you say specialize, what do you mean? Do you mean that you don't play any other competitive sport, but you still play soccer and volleyball and swim recreationally once or twice a week? Is that what you mean as specializing? Because that's what is acceptable. You can specialize pretty young and not be competitive necessarily or formal competitions in these other sports, but you're still doing it regularly. So you're still getting those motor developments in the other environments. You're not just playing tennis all the time. So, the term sport specialization is trying to be defined as you play for one sport more than 9 months of the year, and you basically do it more than 4 days a week. So that's usually the general definition of sports specialization, which sounds pretty similar to what most tennis players do. So most tennis players at a high level do specialize. Doesn't mean you have to do it, but you do have to get enough volume playing tennis to get the skills needed. So I didn't answer your question in a simple statement because I don't think it's fair to do that. You have to look at it case by case, and then also ask yourself, if you do specialize early, which is not necessarily wrong or bad or a negative, but if you do specialize early, you have to then make sure that the athlete's getting the right physical skills in other areas as part of that specialization. And they also have to have enough time off throughout the year so they don't burn out physically, mentally, or emotionally. So it doesn't mean you can't specialize early. It just may mean you have to structure your program. And I work with a lot of athletes that specialize really young. And we talk about how do you do it right so you don't overdo it. And it truly is a case by case based on the genetics of the athlete predominantly. Workload is a huge aspect of this, and certain athletes can handle super high workload. Some athletes can't handle the same amount of workload, and it's not fair to put the same workload on each athlete.
No, that's good. That's important. Let's go. I got a message. Can you please ask when the open stance is used? Sometimes in attacking shots, I see top players attack with an open stance and sometimes with a normal stance. Where on the court do we use each, please?
Sure. So open stance is a time issue normally, meaning that the less time you have, the more likely you're going to hit open stance in most scenarios. So again, it comes down to preference of leg as well. Let's say I'm a right-hander and I'm hitting a forehand. If my right leg is stable and strong, I'm more comfortable hitting an open stance because that's the strength leg and that's the environment that I feel comfortable in. If my left leg's stronger, more stable, I'm more likely to hit more of a square stance or a closed stance more often because I want to put more force through that leg. So that has a lot to do with it without people even realizing it. It's you self-select as a player, the leg that you feel more comfortable loading off. So that's one aspect to it. When and where to do it, I've never, ever forced an athlete into an open stance or a closed stance. You want to see what's natural for them. And then you want to typically have it more closed or square or semi-open if they have some time. And if they don't have time, then they'll usually have to go into an open stance. So I wouldn't overcoach the stances. It's one of those things that, again, it takes that natural aspect of movement and hitting out. And you want to make sure you're not getting in the way as a coach. Too many times coaches overcoach and force an athlete out of what's most natural for them. So in general, the simple answer to the question is both are acceptable depending on the ball that's coming to you, the pace that is coming, and how much time the athlete has.
All right, Mark. I'm sorry, I'm just getting a couple of messages. They can't join. So I just send a couple of links more out. We're going to have a couple more people joining. Here, I was reading something about internal shoulder rotation. Let's go take that one. Thomas Koroniak, what can I do against internal shoulder rotation tightness?
So yeah, there's a lot of things you can do. I mean, if you've heard of a couple of things called the sleeper stretch, internal rotation stretching, that's typically what you will start with. Thoracic mobility is another area that you've got to work on if you've got internal rotation tightness. So there's a lot of information out there, but if the simplest thing is look up a sleeper stretch, look up internal shoulder rotation stretching. We have a lot of resources on that topic, but again, the goal is to be on a structured program for it that you do regularly. Doing it once a week's not going to do anything. The reason is every time you hit a tennis ball, your shoulder, actually, the internal rotation aspect tightens up every time you hit a serve. It's a natural adaptation, which a little bit of stability or tightness is good. But the problem is when you hit 2 hours of serves, we know that you actually get tighter by between 7 and 10 degrees. You lose about 7 to 10 degrees of range of motion. And that's in studies we've done and others have done that have looked at this. That's after one 3-set tennis match. So we know that over time, you get this decrease that continues year after year after year. So you have to reverse that. And you have to do quite a lot of stretching to just make up for what's happening during playing.
Mark, I have a question. So what about like 70% of our shots are internal rotation? Like if you go like serve and forehands, right, in tennis, kind of. So, you know, I was reading a lot. Some people say like, yeah, you just have to stretch. I mean, we are stronger in the front, obviously, right? So we have to work on the decelerators. So, but you can't forget about the front either, right? You can't just start to strengthen the back and then forget about the front, right? I just wanted to bring that up. Is that?
Yeah, no, you're total. There's a couple aspects to what you brought up, a really good point. Because we hit forehands and serves so much, we actually are very strong in our internal rotation strength, but we're tight. So we have limited range of motion. So we're strong, but tight. Whereas the decelerators or external rotation, which is kind of that movement when we go from here to here, that is actually very tight, but quite a bit, you know, so from that standpoint, but from that, it's tight. Sorry, it's got good range, but it's weak. So it's the reverse. So we have to work on the reverse, but that doesn't mean we don't work on the other parts. It's just like, you know, if you've got a great forehand, you need to work more on your backhand, but we're still going to work on the forehand. Same concept, that just because it's more natural for certain areas to be stronger doesn't mean we still don't want to strengthen them. We just don't want a big discrepancy. That's the big concern. And early on in a program, you actually may not work on strengthening the internal rotators because you've got such a big discrepancy. You've got to build up. If this is the difference, we want to build this up to about there before we start working back up, and then we hopefully can go up together.
That's a good point. That's good for me to know as well with my students I'm working with. What stage of the serve does lack of internal shoulder rotation affect most?
Great. So when we're talking about the serve, there's, you know, we use the 8-stage model to help simplify the discussion around it. And, you know, when you've got limited range of motion, it affects you in a few different areas. It affects you in stage 4, which is cocking, because it makes it harder to supinate effectively, which is a component of internal rotation. Supination's at the forearm, but to do it effectively, you still have stuff happening at the shoulder. So there's that component. Then it becomes really, really important once we get to contact, and then long axis rotation, which is contact stage 6, and then stage 7 is long axis rotation, which is that position there. And if you don't have good internal range of motion, you can't get into that position effectively, even though athletes will try, and because it's the most effective, efficient way to hit a serve. The problem is if they're tight there, they'll still get there a little bit, but they'll be restricted. And that, whereas over time, is where we get the shearing forces, and then we actually get the tears. We get the rotator cuff tears, the bicep tendon tears, and that's what happens over years of trying to get to that position. And we have enough speed and force in the serve that we can kind of force it in there, but it's coming from the wrong place and it's pushing against your human limits. And that's why we get the breakdowns that we see, the rotator cuff surgeries, bicep tendon tear surgeries, and all the shoulder impingement issues. So we very clearly understand it now. Like 20 years ago, we didn't understand this as well, about how it happened exactly, what was limited, what was strong, what was weak. Now we have a very clear understanding of what causes a lot of this.
All right, Mark. So guys, just tomorrow we have Mark again. Guys, it's 3 p.m. Central. We're going to break down the serve and Mark's famous 8 stages model. We're going to go through that. It's going to be a little bit more interactive, you know, like, and it's going to be really fun. So don't forget, I'm going to put today another sign up on Instagram and Facebook and everything. You have to sign up for that one as well. You can't just sign up for one seminar and be in all of them. So yeah, join us tomorrow again, and keep the serve questions for tomorrow if you can. Let's see, let's keep going. So Svetlana was writing, hey Davor, a question for Mark. I have an 11-year-old female daughter who does whose toes point outwards on squats and ready position. What correction exercises are recommended?
So great question. So if we're talking here, these are her feet. She's saying as she's squatting, her toes are pointing out like that. So by itself, we don't know enough information to say whether that's good or bad. That's not a bad thing. That's actually natural for the body to do that. Why does the body do that? Because it's easier to recruit the glutes and the backside of your body, which is actually a bit stronger, your glutes are. So the folks that squat the most amount of weight in the world, power lifters, world's strongest man, Olympic weightlifters, they all squat with their feet out like that. So that's the natural way the body wants to handle the most amount of load. So why do some people coach you out of that? And they say, hey, we want our toes to stay forward. What's the reason? Reason for that is we don't just want to work on those external rotators, because the moment you turn your feet out like that, you're externally rotating and you're already stronger there. We're a little weaker internally. And that's why it's the natural body's motion to turn them out. So you have to ask yourself, why is she doing that? Is she doing that because the weight is too much? Possibly, maybe not. It's normally the body's natural way of squatting. So don't sort of think it's abnormal. It's actually the more normal movement. Why we sometimes want her to not do that and train squatting with, toes forward, is we want to get her strong, internally rotated and strong as well, because that's really important for change of direction, loading into the corners and coming out of the corners on a tennis court. And if we just load her in that external rotated position from a young age, she's going to get strong in that position, but she's going to be quite weak when she needs to do those other positions. So that's the main reason why when they're young, we recommend, partly because you shouldn't be lifting with a lot of weight. The goal is to try to train that at that stage. And then as she gets older and older, she may start lifting heavier and heavier, and then the feet may start coming out a little bit.
Okay, nice. All right, Lachlan Puyol, when is a good age to teach pronation on the serve? Let's talk about that tomorrow, guys. Keep that, Lachlan. I know you well. I just do that tomorrow, please. Rodney Harmon, what is the best way to train the first movements for players looking to run around their backhands and hit inside in or inside out forehands?
Yeah, great question. And that one really has to do with understanding the quickest way to move. And it's the only movement on the tennis court where we're not going in a straight line. So a run around forehand requires us to actually go in a semicircle. So we're actually going to go in a semicircle position, meaning that when they're facing the net, their right leg for a right-handed player is actually going to drop behind them, and it's going to be like a drop step. So, and the important aspect there is that their hips turn, they take as large a step as they can while maintaining body position and control. But the largest step they can is the first step. And then from there, they can either take a second one or they can then shuffle to the position they need to get to. But it's that first step which is the difference. And if you watch every great run around forehand, Roger Federer does it just about as well as anyone. His is more efficient. Rafael Nadal, for example, has a great run around forehand, but he takes one extra step than Roger normally. So he's a little less efficient in how he does it. And he spends more energy covering the same amount of distance. He still does it phenomenally well. But if he would have learned at a young age to do it the other way, it potentially would have saved him a little bit from an efficiency standpoint. So again, the goal is to get to the right position. And that's really, really important.
Okay, here we go. Rajiv is asking, I've noticed some coaches locally are teaching all their kids to kick their rear leg back on ground strokes. Like Bob Lutz and his approach shot. When is such a move appropriate other than an approach shot using closed stance?
Yeah, great question. So teaching a finish is style. I talk a lot about what's a style and what's a fundamental. And there are some biomechanical reasons why your leg will kick back. It's a counter movement, so you don't pretty much fall flat on the face and hit the ground. However, there's zero reason to teach it. If your athlete is loading right and then accelerating correctly, the leg will kick up naturally and appropriately. So teaching the finish is pretty inefficient and actually can usually create some bad motor patterns many times because the athlete's worried about the finish, which has nothing to do with contact. So be careful about over focusing on style and make sure you're teaching fundamentals. So some people may be doing that to try to get them to change something earlier in the motion by chance. That causes, and that by finishing that way, you may get lucky and they may change something earlier. But I always try to teach loading better and then acceleration. If you do those two things, the finish will always be correct, because the body position is in the right spot. If you're teaching the finish, you're teaching in a reverse order of what's happening. So you aren't actually teaching the stroke. So hopefully that answers that. But every person that loads right and accelerates right is going to finish correctly.
Okay, that's a good point. And then another question from Nicholas Bennett. Makes me nervous having not been certified as a personal trainer or physical therapist. I want to be able to help my players. Can we effectively help them with the books, Mark? Like you mentioned, that's one point. Just quickly, Mark. At the beginning of my career, like I was like scared as well, like to work on kids with something, and if you really dive into it, and it's like having with the doctor that has a surgery, someone who had the same surgery 10,000 times going to see certain things, right? So like you have to jump into it and then help your players as much as you can and learn from that. It's my opinion. I just wanted to throw that out because I went through the same thought process 10 years ago, but now I feel like very comfortable doing that.
Yeah, no, you got to stay in your scope. If you're a tennis coach, I assume that was a tennis coach asking that question. You don't want to get into the world of physical therapy. You don't want to get into the world of advanced strength and conditioning. That's not what you're trained for, and there are experts that do that. What you do want to know is have enough knowledge that, one, concepts, two, that you can talk to the strength coach and the physical therapist about your player and making sure you guys are on the same page about what you're working on. So the International Tennis Performance Association is the right resource for that. And if you're a tennis coach, start with the Tennis Performance Trainer certification. That's why it was designed. It was designed especially for tennis coaches to get a knowledge in all these areas: strength training, movement training, fitness testing, injury rehab, periodization planning, nutrition, all these areas that a coach needs to be aware of, but doesn't need to be the expert in. So hopefully that helps, because the worst thing you can do is try to do something that you're really not proficient in. You just because, you read a book on heart surgery doesn't mean you're going to perform heart surgery. You're going to get the cardiologist to do that, and the heart surgeon to do that. Same thing in this space, especially if you're working with really high level players, because the precise aspect of training becomes really, really important.
So Mark, so I know you work with a lot of universities and their coaches, and you educate their strength and conditioning coaches in tennis specifically. So all the head coaches and the coaches, like they as you said, right, they know enough to communicate with you, but in the end of the day, you're working with that strength and conditioning coach at that university, for example, and then they get that tennis specific from you.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, it's really, really important to make sure that the knowledge is shared, people understand their roles, and then because the goal is to make the players better. And that's really all this is. This is about understanding the components. Like, it's the same at the pro level. They have larger teams many times. Sometimes there's 6, 8 people in these discussions: massage therapist, physical therapist, medical doctor, agent, parent, coach, strength coach, and they all have to make sure they understand what they're trying to do to help that player succeed.
Okay. Let's go. David, can you talk about? Let's see. What do we have here? Curious. Have you the thoughts on this program? No, wait. I saw something earlier. I wanted to take on. Give me 1 second, guys. Oh, could you please post the books again? I didn't get the second one. Guys, I'm going to send you an email tonight with every single link Mark is sending me and every book recommendations. And I'm going to write you guys a nice email later where you get all the information on the books and everything. So
I just posted a few links if folks want to go, and you can put those into your browser, just save them and then kind of look through. There's a lot of resources at the Kovacs Institute and Kovacs Academy, and you can kind of see what's out there.
Alexei asking, how many approximately static stretching sessions should a tennis player do per week? And what is the advantage of static stretches or overactive isolated stretches?
Yeah, so stretching is an interesting topic. It's simple in some respects. You want to get certain areas of the body to have more mobility, and mobility is usually through motion. But if an individual has limited range, it's hard to get them mobile in a limited range. So normally the way I suggest it is static stretching is a little bit easier for most people to do because you're usually on the ground or you're doing it in a static position, which means you're not moving. So you can do it multiple times throughout the day. You usually don't get super sweaty doing it. So you can do it in smaller increments throughout the day and get some range of motion benefits. Dynamic stretching or active stretching, which is different than active isolated stretching. Active isolated stretching is actually a stretching technique where you hold a stretch for approximately 2 seconds and then you release it and then you go further and release it, and you do it usually somewhere about 10 times. And that's a form of stretching that is quite difficult for some people because you got to push close to your limits. So it increases range, which is a good thing. So stretching becomes a little complicated like that. The biggest thing you want to remember is dynamic stretching or your dynamic warm-ups should be done predominantly before activity, and then static stretching should be done after your activity or at a time later in the day when you're not having to then perform speed, strength, power activities after it. So that's the easiest way to think about it. It's pretty hard to overstretch for a tennis player. Most tennis players don't overstretch. Out of the thousands of tennis players I've dealt with, I've never really seen a player that's been hypermobile. It doesn't really happen much in the tennis environment because of the sport. I've worked with some gymnasts that have been hypermobile. I've worked with a few other sports that have, but just because of the nature of the sport and how we tighten up every day by playing, it's somewhat hard to be hypermobile.
Mark, I have a question. I heard that somewhere. I don't know if it's true, so I wanted to ask you, since we're at the stretching topic. Is it true that if you hold your stretch for like static stretching less than a certain amount of time, that when you're done with that stretch, that everything goes back into initial position without you gaining actually anything?
No, not necessarily. I mean, if you static stretch, you will get adaptation.
Okay.
It won't be the same total length. If you spend 10 minutes stretching and you start at this length and at the end of the 10 minutes you're at that length, it does go back pretty close to where the initial length is, but you will see, say, a little bit of improvement. Okay. And each day that improvement gets more and more and more and more. But it's not the same as what it felt like. If you say you were this far away from touching your toes at the beginning of the session, at the end of the session, you were touching your toes. But by an hour later, if you measured it, you'd still be back pretty close to where you started. So that is true, but it's not exactly where you started. You'll get a bit of improvement, and that each day that improvement becomes real. That's why if you do 2 weeks of static stretching, you'll see an improvement in your range of motion.
Okay. I had a couple of questions sent to me as well to ask you. So we have one more on here. I'm going to go like ankle mobility. Like how is the like ankle mobility affecting, like, for example, like the ground strokes or like the serve? I think that's a topic that's not focused a lot on, I feel like, in the coaching industry. So maybe you can give us a little bit.
Yeah, so ankle mobility is something it's interesting because it's very focused on in the strength and conditioning world. It's very focused on in the track and field world. I've been working with athletes pretty much my entire career on ankle mobility. It's part of every session. The reason being is it's the most important joint or the last joint before your forces go into the ground. So your foot goes into the ground. So it's really, really an area that you've got to make sure that you spend a lot of time on. And if you don't know much about ankle mobility, I definitely get, understand it. If you go to Kovacs Academy, we have a ton of stuff on ankle mobility, how to take care of your feet, your ankles, your toes. Big toe function is another area that is related to this that doesn't get as much focus in the tennis community. And when you wear shoes, your feet sort of stop moving because they're compacted, which is good for some safety purposes, but it also limits how your foot functions, how your arch functions. And, over time, that can cause some problems up the chain as well. So we want to make sure that we understand ankle mobility and how we utilize that effectively.
All right, Mark, you see often in junior tennis that the kids have problems to combine like the lower and the upper body. They a lot of kids hit out of the upper body and they don't load properly, and they don't. It feels like to me sometimes when I teach kids that the lower body is just like a foreign object, and they just hit out of the upper body. What are ways for the players of like to work on maybe a little bit to start to feel actually, the lower body and the legs especially, and using all the ground force power and all that stuff?
Yeah, so the biggest challenge is how we teach. Most people, when they first teach someone, or if a player first learns to play tennis, you teach upper body, you teach the swing, you teach contact. You want them to make contact, get the ball over the net, and have some immediate success. The problem is many people never get past that stage in the early years. It's just, okay, make contact and get it over and feel like you're making solid contact. As soon as possible, we need to teach lower body. We need to teach loading. We need to teach the ability to hold the racket, turn your hips, turn your shoulders, load the legs. And that needs to be early. The problem is it usually doesn't happen early. It happens when you start getting a player who starts getting more serious, and then it becomes hard. So it's one of the fallacies of how tennis is taught in most clubs and throughout the world, because you want immediate success. But as we know, usually what gives us immediate success doesn't necessarily help us as much in the long term as doing it right from day one. So we have to find that balance between getting the ball over the net and in the court easily. But as soon as possible, we want to start loading the legs, getting the hip turn, and then that becomes a pretty easy cycle going forward. So it's really important that coaches focus on that. And that's the biggest issue. It's not that hard for players to do. It's just if they haven't done it for a number of years, let's say they're 5 through 8, they never did it. And then at 8 or 9, someone tries to get them to do it. It's not so easy at that point. They've had 3 years of doing it the wrong way. Sometimes it's 5 years of doing it the wrong way.
7 years.
Yeah, I get 15, 16-year-olds that are top national players that still have problems. They're really good with their hands. They make up for it because their hands are so good, but they have very little lower body engagement, and they're weak down there. They don't rotate well. And a lot of the time they come because they either don't have enough power, or they're starting to get upper body injuries, and then they don't understand why.
So Mark, you teach them, then when they come to you and they have problems, first of all, like you let them shadow and you let them do things without the medicine ball, without weights, and then you increase and then you go from there.
Yeah, and a lot of it is tied into their hitting sessions. It's not, hey, everything we do in the gym is by itself and then you go hit. It's, hey, we teach the movement, and then we have progressions where you make sure that you're hitting 10 balls, then doing 5 band exercises or med ball drills or something, and then you hit another 10 balls, and you try to train the cycle. It's the best way for them to learn, because how often do we have these athletes, and especially at the higher levels, you see it a lot, where they do really well with med balls in the weight room, they load phenomenally well, and then they go back on the court and they don't look any different. And coaches get frustrated. They're like, well, they're doing all this gym work. I want them to get rotational power better. I want them to load their legs better. And then 3 months later, they don't seem to have improved much on court. And that's usually, there's just no transfer. They're putting in the work, they're putting in the time. The program design just isn't optimized.
So is that the integrated approach then, right? To put
Exactly.
it like, yeah, all right. Let's keep going with a couple. Let's go with guys. We have like 5 to 8 more minutes. Maybe let's get like the last questions in here. Is there any exercise to fix knees that are getting close to each other when squatting?
Yeah, so that's a similar issue to what we saw on those serves that the players' knees were collapsing. That's the same kind of discussion. Normally, it's a hip strength stability issue, or it's an ankle mobility issue, or a lot of the time it's both. Their ankles are stiff and they have no range, so you can't get in the right position, and as a result, the knee collapses in, and the hips aren't strong enough or stable enough to load, so the knee collapses because that's the easiest way for the body to do the movement you're asking. So if you have players that have that, nearly always it's a physical issue. Sometimes it's easy just to say don't do it and correct it technically, but nearly always the reason they're doing it is because it's easier for them, it's more comfortable for them.
All right. What are the weakest muscles a tennis player usually has?
Yeah, great question. So we have a very clean picture of tennis players because the sport is, you hit thousands of hours, so you have these adaptations that occur. Internal shoulder rotation is strong, external shoulder rotation is weak, and that the external rotation is weak. We have abdominal issues many times due to poor technique. Not that they're weak so much, but that they're actually too strong in certain movements and too weak in others. So the abdominal pain, abdominal injuries is a bit of an issue. Lower back is one of the concerns for tennis players. Normally, lower back problems are a result of hamstring tightness, weak glutes, so the muscle in the glutes, because tennis players are very quad dominant. How many times does the coach say, get low, bend your knees, be in your athletic position, get on the balls of your feet? Every one of those cues pushes the weight into the quads, and that's what makes a tennis player very quad dominant. So that's not necessarily a negative. That's how you got to play the sport. We're not saying any of those cues are wrong. The problem is the glutes don't work very well in those positions. They're not the prime movers in those positions. So we need to strengthen the glutes, because every time the force goes into the ground, though, the glutes do play a big role. And so majority of the time, the quads are overdeveloped. The backside of the body, you'll hear the term posterior chain, which is glutes, hamstrings, calves, the backside of the body, and the lower back. That's all sort of connected. And that's why we get so many challenges with the back. The back is the number one injury across age groups, which is the biggest complaint. Juniors, college, pro, adult. Lower back is where we get the majority of the complaints. You also get knee problems and shoulder problems, of course, but lower back is a big challenge because of that. So if you fix the posterior chain, strengthen those muscles that are naturally weakened because of how we coach and how we want our athletes to play sometimes, it corrects a lot of that.
All right. Mark, the last 3 questions we're going to take. All right. So any exercises to get the hips firing on ground strokes?
Yeah. So when you say hips firing, I'm not exactly sure what you mean, because it could be rotational firing like that way, but it could also be forward and back. So it depends a bit on what you mean by hips firing.
Let's take the rotational a little bit, because probably on the ground, might be.
Yep. So yeah, if you're talking about like a rotational movement, so you start and then you release, you have to start. And that's where most people struggle. They don't load right. So we call stage 3, which is loading of the forehand, let's say, or the backhand, is you have to load enough and you have to store enough energy to be able to release it. It's a very simple physics concept. For every action, we have an equal and opposite reaction. So if we want to accelerate into the ball, we have to store first. And most of the time, the issue is people aren't storing. And it's a very simple fix. To me, fixing the forehand is one of the easiest strokes to fix, because it's rotate, load, and then forget it. When I say forget it, I mean accelerate naturally, and nearly always the athlete will do it correctly once they load right. So you've got to get them started right.
when they load, I see a lot of players that just put the leg out there and put the weight on there. But as you said, you have to load into the hip, right? So you have to
Yeah,
rotate the upper body, like, and then you have to like get
yeah, you
into
have
that.
to turn away from your target. So your upper body has, and your hips have to turn away from your target.
Yeah.
One of the reasons players don't like doing that though is because that's a limitation in internal rotation of the hip. Most people don't realize it because we always think about on the forehand, you turn your toe out a little bit on the outside leg, and that's external rotation, which it is. But then you actually turn in over your hip. And when you turn your upper body over your hip, your hips turn. And when you're tight there, internal rotation of the hip is tight, you can't turn as far. And that's where we see a lot of limitations. So hopefully that made sense. I know it's not so easy to follow when we're talking through some of these movements, but in general, hip tightness is one of the reasons people don't load so well. It's not always a strength issue. And a lot of times people think I just got to get stronger. Usually it's not a strength issue. It's a mobility issue. They're not mobile enough in that area.
All right, two more. What's your take on wearing orthotics while on the court?
Yeah, so orthotics is a great area and it can be very helpful. It's like tennis rackets. Tennis rackets are great. You just got to make sure it's right for you. It's the right weight. It has the right string in it, and it's designed for your game. Orthotics are exactly the same. You can't say orthotics are good or bad. Good orthotics are really good. Bad orthotics are really bad because it has to be designed for your issue. So don't look at it as good or bad. Just make sure you go to someone that has experience working with tennis players, preferably, but at least working with athletes.
And then I picked the last one because a lot of recreational players, I feel like they, so I don't have any knee problems yet. Is it good to wear the knee support to prevent any? So I get that, I get that so many times too. And then, yeah, here we
Yeah.
have.
So if you're talking a knee support, like a compression sleeve is usually, I think, what you're talking about.
I hope it's a
Brace.
compression. I hope it's not like the support, like you have like an ankle support.
Yeah, like a
I
knee
always tell my,
brace. Yeah, so a knee brace is different than a compression sleeve. Both of them actually don't prevent injuries. So don't wear those thinking you're going to prevent an injury. Normally, what the support is there for is one, psychologically, to make you feel like there's something there, but two, it keeps it warm. So if you have knee tendonitis, if you have patellar tendonitis, arthritis, it may help a little bit because it keeps it a little warmer and it sweats underneath the compression sleeve. So that provides some value. But to prevent a knee turning or tearing something, it doesn't do that. Even the braces aren't designed to do that really. They're just there for some psychological support, but the compression especially can heat it up and keep it warmer, which can be really useful, especially if the weather's not that warm. If the temperatures are below 60 degrees, wearing a compression sleeve can be good even if you have no knee problems, just to keep the joint warm.
I like that one. Well, Mark, all right. So that was amazing. I can't thank you enough. We got like amazing feedback already. Guys, just a reminder, I sent, so it's going to be a series of 20, 30, 40 webinars. And everybody who signed up for the webinars, you always get the material from the presenters and even the one that signed up in the past. So you get everything you need. Mark has amazing stuff. And tomorrow, you do not want to miss the serve biomechanically, like broken down the 8 stages. Yeah, it's unbelievable value, guys. Actually, for free, what you get to have someone like Mark here. Mark, I cannot thank you enough for always investing and educating others. And you spend your whole life. I mean, that's your baby. You spend your whole life in your profession, and you're one of the best in the field. And I learned so much from you, from your books, from everything I saw from you, all the stuff that's online. I think we cannot thank you enough for taking your time.
No, thanks for organizing it. I know it's a lot of effort getting all these things together. And, the biggest thing is, trying to be as efficient as possible. And I just want to thank you for everything you're doing as well.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Yeah, as you see, you can see the feedback. It's so nice. It's nice to see that always. Like we put so much work into it, and like people think, yeah, Mark Kovacs is one of the best in the world, and everything goes smoothly. He puts like me, like we put like hours and hours and hours, and Mark does so much free things. It's unbelievable. And yeah, in the end, you get a good back when you read those feedbacks. That's what I like about that.
Awesome.
All right, guys. I see you tomorrow, 3 p.m. Central, 10 p.m. German time, 4 p.m. Eastern. And Mark, enjoy your day. Guys, thank you for joining. And yeah, I'll see you guys tomorrow.